So here we are. The video wouldn't go active. I don't know if anybody caught that. But anyway, here we are. Hopefully this thumbnail doesn't get my video taken down because you can't talk about history anymore, in many cases. But anyway, I want to talk about some of NATO's desperate propaganda. It has certainly been no shortage of it, but an article this morning caught my eye on the Newsbreak app. So I just thought I'd kind of chime in and give my 2 cents about this whole thing. So basically there was and this article was from Business Insider. So Business Insider's got some good articles. It's got a lot of crap too. It's not I guess it's not one of the bona fide news sources. Even, those peddle crap too. But it seems like a lot of crazy shit can get posted on Business Insider. So anyway, this article, the gist of it was that Russia doesn't have enough combat pilots, fighter pilots, bomber pilots with tactical bomber pilots with combat experience willing to serve in Ukraine. So basically it's the typical American, just laugh at somebody you don't like and just humiliate them to feel good about yourself. That's what the news is all about. You pick a station that fits your bias, and then you sit down for a show where you're encouraged to laugh at the people that don't want to do things your way. Doesn't matter if you're left or right. Anytime the news tells, Americans or just Westerners in general that somebody is the enemy, people love this shit. They love the humiliation. And because that's the only way that most people have to feel better about themselves. People's churches do this. People's religions do this. They tell people to, hate other churches, other religions. So it's a bunch of nonsense. So this article was just ridiculous. It's saying that, Russia doesn't have enough qualified fighter pilots because there's been so much friendly fire. They've shot down so many of their own planes. And they're citing this, some former U.S. official, which if you don't say somebody's name, that could just be somebody in a newsroom making some shit up and saying, oh, well, a former official told me. Well, yeah, who? So whenever you see this, whenever you see, a former official said such and such, it's usually bullshit. Sometimes it isn't, but it's usually bullshit. So, and then it goes on and it says, well, it hasn't been in these Russian shoot downs of their own planes haven't been in the double digits, but it's been more than one or two. And it's like, okay, 3. You know what I mean? And the other thing too is the person writing this article must think that none of the audience knows how a military works. Because when you're in any country's military, you don't have a whole lot of choice picking and choosing your assignments. You're given orders. When you're given orders, you have to follow those orders. If you don't follow those orders, you go to friggin' jail. So if you're some kind of Russian fighter pilot and you're told, yeah, you're being deployed to the front in Ukraine, you're going to go or you're going to get locked up. You're never going to fly again. So a bunch of fucking nonsense. But, and the other thing too is like this whole Ukraine war has been just so dishonestly depicted. They have this depiction that, the Russians are throwing everything their military has at Ukraine and they're getting their asses kicked. And it's like, I heard a guy the other day, he made a really good comparison. And he said, Russia right now is treating this Ukraine war the same way the Soviet Union treated the Battle of Britain. So if you're not familiar with the Battle of Britain, It was basically an air battle that went on over the skies of the UK because the idea was that the German Air Force during World War II was trying to destroy the British Air Force. So they wanted to bomb the airfields and the planes on the ground. And the idea was that, they were contemplating some sort of an invasion of England. So they wanted to basically soften the place up and more than anything, just demoralize the British people. So that was probably the major objective. So in that comparison, the Russians are treating this Ukraine war like the Soviets treated the Battle of Britain. Well, the Soviets weren't involved in the Battle of Britain. They were involved in a meat grinder with the German army on the Eastern Front, in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland. They were the ones that won World War II. They did about 90% of the heavy lifting. So, in the Battle of Britain, some thousands of people were lost, but I mean, the Russians would lose 2 million plus people in a big battle during World War II. America only lost about 400,000 people, and the UK lost about the same, about 400,000 people. So, yeah, the Battle of Britain was, and even, World War II for America and Britain were just these little sideshows. So, yeah, the Russian military isn't really, they're not full in on this whole Ukraine thing. It's a fucking annoyance to them that the US, which is the country really puppeteering NATO, they've broken the agreements and have kept moving farther and farther. Because like I'm always saying, in 1995, Bill Clinton signed the Belgrade Agreement, said that the US wouldn't push NATO any farther eastward back in 1995. So as a reference point, Belgrade, Serbia is about as far east as, the German-Polish border, maybe Western Poland. So the US has gone total Indian giver on that treaty and has put NATO allies on Russia's borders and all kinds of missile systems and weapons and tanks, just like they treated the American Indians, the natives here. They broke every treaty they ever made. A treaty with the US really doesn't mean a whole lot. So, yeah. Russia's not really putting much effort into this. But Americans, especially baby boomer men, they love anything in the news that humiliates the Germans and the Russians because they've been brought up to hate both countries. So it's completely ridiculous. And stories like this and just all these stories that are saying, oh, Russia's going to collapse, Russia's military and, the Russian government's going to collapse any day now. This is an indication of desperation. This is a bunch of frightened psychopaths and narcissists who've gotten in too deep. And so basically, I think they want to reserve the right to sell this war to their people, especially America. So if somebody decides to have some kind of a land war, they want to be able to convince, young Americans to sign up for the military if need be. Excuse me. I don't think it's going to come to that, but they like to leave their options open. Psychopaths see human beings as human resources. This is why in the corporate world, the personnel department became human resources, because human beings are just seen as resources. So yeah, they spend all this time in the media just trying to ridicule and demean and laugh at Russia. Nobody defeats Russia in land wars on their own turf. It just doesn't happen. They grind up the Russian landscape, the winters, the mud in the spring, the summer heat. The Russian people, when they fight back, they grind up any invader that comes along. The Mongolians, Napoleon, the Teutonic Knights from Germany, the Third Reich, you name it, they grind them up. So yeah, this is a bunch of bullshit, but it's a bunch of desperate psychopaths who've gotten in too deep. And an interesting thing with this Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a few interesting things. One, a minority of Ukrainians identify themselves as Ukrainian. The majority, was probably about almost 2/3 of Ukrainians identify as Russian, and then some more identify as Polish, and then really a small minority of Ukrainians actually identifies as Ukrainians. And the eastern 2/3 of Ukraine used to be Russia, but it was given to the Ukrainians by Lenin after Lenin took all the food from Ukraine and starved the people. And he basically stuck a pacifier in their mouths and he said, oh, here's some land, here's some nationalism. So a bunch of nonsense. And then, oh God, I'm losing my train of thought. Oh, the other thing I was going to talk about too is this. So Russia's invading to get the territory back, and Russian Federation republics have actually been set up among these Russian populations in Ukraine. So Ukraine's never getting that territory back. The other thing, I think the biolab theory is very plausible that Russia wanted to grab evidence from biolabs doing gain of function research for, the likes of Pfizer, Merck, GlaxoSmith, J&J, Johnson & Johnson, all of them. So then there's that. And then the other thing too is that I think this invasion of Ukraine by Russia really, it halted the whole scamdemic, the pushing of the scamdemic and the mandatory needlecraft. Really, the globalists had to shift their focus to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think we do owe a debt of gratitude to the Russian military, the Russian government, Mr. Putin, for just putting that whole thing on hold indefinitely. It was going to collapse under its own weight, but I think that really sped it up. And, I'm not glorifying this war. I'm not saying it's a great thing, but the reasons certainly explain the whole situation. And just so many bizarre things around this and around just NATO itself, and even the European Union, which has been getting pushed farther east. And, Ukraine was very happy as Russia's principal trading partner because they share language, they share culture. But the EU wanted to basically loot the Ukraine's national wealth and bring them into the EU. Because the EU is a big financial piracy scam where mostly German bankers are looking to steal national wealth and bring people into that whole European Union. So between NATO and the EU, the European Union, these are really kind of the new German empires that started rising up, in the late 1940s, 1950s. And, it's interesting. I made some notes here. You have officials over the years who they were officials in the Third Reich, and then they made a pretty much seamless transition into NATO and the EU, even the United Nations, not to mention all the tens of thousands of Nazis that got new homes in America after the war. So everybody knows about Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun was a rocket scientist. His facility in Eastern Germany on the Baltic coast was in Peenemünde. He used slave labor to build those rockets. It was highly dangerous work. And then he was imported to the U.S. after World War II. He was a major in the SS. He was a card-carrying Nazi. He was spared war crimes trial. And he became the first head of NASA. Then with NATO, you had a man named Adolf Heusinger. Adolf Heusinger was he was on the general staff during World War II. So this is somebody who would have dealt with Hitler on an almost day-to-day basis. He was chief of operations for the Wehrmacht, the regular German army. So an important thing about World War II is that you had the regular German army, the vast, 99% or more. 99% or more of the German military were not Nazis. They were fighting for their country. They felt a sense of loyalty for their country, and they saw the Nazi Party as basically a parasite that was using Germany as a host. So, but when you look at a general in that military during that war, it's like you have to wonder, well, yeah, maybe he wasn't a Nazi Party member, but he knew what beast he was serving. So you have to consider that. So he did that job, and then after the war, 1961 through 1964, he was the chairman for the NATO military committee. So very high-ranking member of NATO. So that's pretty wild. And then you want to look at the EU. So the EU, there was a man named Walter Hallstein. He was the first president of the Commission of the European Economic Committee. So he's a founding father of the European Union. Now, this guy wasn't a heavy hitter. He was a junior officer. He was a lieutenant in the German army. Served in France, served in the invasion and the occupation. And he was captured after D-Day and shipped off to a POW camp in the U.S. So, I wouldn't call this guy some kind of big-time Nazi, but the Western establishment, they love to just call anyone they don't like a Nazi. They love to appear very anti-Nazi, and it's like, well, if you were that serious, you might not allow these people into positions of power. And with the European Union, with the EU, when you dig into that, it was actually the whole thing was conceived by and funded by German bankers largely. There were some heavy hitters from France involved, but it was really a German creation. It was a German aristocracy, the very wealthy, if not entitled aristocracy, then people who became wealthy, through industry and banking and things like that. And that's an interesting thing when you look at the Nazi Party. It was actually created and funded by German aristocrats with the addition of Wall Street funding. So, without these aristocrats and these financiers, it never could have happened. And then an interesting thing too is towards war's end, basically, Martin Bormann, who was he was Hitler's personal secretary. He was a finance minister of the Third Reich. He basically co-opted all of the heads of industry in their giant industrial cartels and conglomerates. And he offered them massive financial support because the Nazi Party had so much loot. He did this in exchange for, he gave them loot and they gave him basically their foreign cash reserves so that the Nazi government in exile could function. And they also shared information. So these giant industrial cartels in the days of Nazi Germany had espionage offices, and they would conduct industrial espionage or just espionage in the countries that they were based in. So the Third Reich never really went away. It basically went corporate. It went legitimate. It's like in The Godfather, Michael Corleone says, "We're going legitimate." So what they did was the Nazi Party entwined itself with these giant industrial conglomerates like IG Farben, for example. And all of these companies had joint patents with American companies. So basically after the war, they couldn't take away these patents, and this income from these German companies. So they would have been had their asses sued off in court if they had. So yeah, the Third Reich just rolled on. So the EU was really the new German Empire. It was like the new Reich. And then this is very true in a lot of ways for NATO too, because many thousands of the Nazis, they received America as a new home. They were founding fathers of CIA, NASA, NSA, the medical system here in America, the aerospace industry as we know it. So you had a lot of Nazis at CIA, for example, creating American military and political strategy after the war. So yeah, NATO and European Union are in that family. Then, another example of these people, you had Kurt Waldheim. Kurt Waldheim was 1972 to 81. He was the UN Secretary General. He was president of Austria from 86 through 92. And during the war, he was a junior intelligence officer. So regular military, not a Nazi. But intelligence people, especially during like a serious war, you have to give them a second look. Because they know more than most people in the military in many circumstances. And it's kind of a different level of commitment. And depending on the type of intelligence they do, they can be really good at lying and manipulating. Kurt Waldheim, he served in Yugoslavia and Greece. So really messy theaters of that war. Yeah. So pretty interesting. I think this whole effort of the EU and NATO to basically encircle and eventually attempt to penetrate Russia and to, perhaps to aspire to conduct a regime change in Russia. This is just a continuation of Operation Barbarossa. If you're not a history nerd like me, Operation Barbarossa was the Third Reich, was Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, which was an abject disaster for the first, So it was June 41. Yeah, for the first, but the first year and a half, they did really well. And they really bloodied the Soviets' noses. But by the end of, it was the end of 1942 in the Battle of Stalingrad, the Third Reich got its ass kicked and they started getting pushed westward, and the whole thing ended in Berlin in 1945. So they made a terrible mistake by, poking the Russian bear, and you shouldn't poke that bear. So it's a continuation of Operation Barbarossa. And really, when you look at the United States after World War II, all of the wars that we've been involved in were basically modeled on Operation Barbarossa. So the whole idea with Nazi Germany invading of Russia, Soviet Union, was that they wanted to kick the farmers in Eastern Europe off their land and take the farmland so that they could set up these giant, basically corporate farms so that they could feed the German population. And they wanted to grow the population. There was this whole concept called Lebensraum. Lebensraum means living space. So they wanted to grow the German population, and they wanted to resettle them in Eastern Europe and Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. So they wanted to have these giant corporate farms out there. Well, we have those now. And, and you've got people like Bill Gates, who's like the largest owner of farmland in the US right now. And he's involved in this whole creation of lab-grown meat and wants to urge people to eat crickets and beetles and stuff. Well, Heinrich Himmler, who they have very similar energies, I think. They're like these genocidal twerps, um, just frightened little genocidal twerps. Heinrich Himmler was a former pig farmer, and he was obsessed with creating like these super chickens who could lay these super eggs. So interesting coincidence in their obsessions. Um, yeah, and then the other thing too with the invasion of Soviet Union by Nazi Germany was they wanted to go east and then swing down into the Caucasus to occupy the Caspian Sea oil fields in Azerbaijan. So Stalingrad was the last major city standing in their way of the oil fields, and that's where they got turned back. So after World War II, the U.S. basically, urged by, its corporate masters, and then under the direction of CIA, who works for the corporate masters, just like the political parties, there was this campaign of conducting warfare in the third world. Europe was too devastated to have a war until now. And so they conducted all this warfare in the third world, hot wars, cold wars, dirty wars. So regime changes in Latin America and setting up secret police down there. Then you had, things like Vietnam War, and then Panama. What else? 2 wars in Iraq, and then the invasion of Afghanistan. They basically had it was the same type of war that Nazi Germany was waging in Soviet Union. It was like, get in there, run a body count, steal the resources, and just basically total chaos. So that's what the US has been up to. Again, with you had the Nazis as the founding fathers, half of the founding fathers of Central Intelligence, and then NSA, National Security Agency, each. So it's like we're living it again. Nazi Germany was absolutely obsessed with invading and conquering Russia, and it's like, well, here we go again. And then it's certainly no coincidence you've got a Klaus Schwab, who's the figurehead for the World Economic Forum, German aristocrat, thick German accent, totally creepy. He'd fit the part perfectly if you put an SS uniform on him, or some like a German military, German army general's uniform on him, from the World War II days. So it was definitely there was a pretty much immediate reincarnation of the Third Reich after World War II, in my opinion. You had a Nazi international, you had a Nazi government in exile, places like Argentina, possibly Antarctica. That can be, I don't know, it can be a little far-fetched, but who knows. But then you had many, you had thousands of Nazis brought into America to basically set up new institutions and really starting to change American society to be more like the Third Reich very gradually. So it's crazy, it's all happening again. So there was this reincarnation, and I think Dr. Fauci is he's a good candidate for like the reincarnation of like a Dr. Joseph Mengele. Mengele probably, he was alive in South America after the war. Fauci was born in the early 1940s. So they were contemporaries for some time, but I don't know, it kind of lends some credence to the idea of walk-ins, where a soul will walk into the body of a living person and basically displace the soul that was in there originally. So yeah, they're like the same kind of maniacal, evil, sadistic, nerdy twerps that ran Nazi Germany. No, I'm not putting nerds down. I've been a nerd my whole life, but I don't seek to, get revenge on people because I wasn't popular enough or something. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. So, and then when you take into account the whole transit of Uranus, so Uranus right now, it's in the same degrees sidereally. It's in the same degrees of Aries that it was in what month are we in? February 1939. And then tropically, same degrees of Taurus it was in 1939. So September 1st, 1939 was when World War II kicked off. That's when Poland was invaded by the Third Reich. So September 1st this year, that is, Uranus will have made its full 84-year orbit. We're back. So we're back to a reoccurrence. And but I don't interpret that as like a horrible, bloody or a horrible nuclear World War III. World War III is going on in the heart and the mind, and it's already been happening. We've been involved in this buildup, and there was a long buildup to World War II, to the events of September 1939. There was a buildup. The Third Reich started carving territory out of other countries, and they annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia and all these places. And then one day they're like, okay, we're really going to go for it now. So we haven't seen crazy yet, but I don't see a giant conventional war. This is taking place in people's minds, in people's hearts. And this is why reality is dissolving right now. So the globalists keep pushing agendas and trying to advance their goals. And when the people push back at this point, they're basically saying that the whole thing was a conspiracy theory, even though it's in their papers and their publications. So it's crazy. Like reality is literally evaporating. And it's like the author Alan Moore, really brilliant writer. Alan Moore said that our culture would turn to steam in the near future. So here it is. All right, so I'm going to leave it at that. Try to keep these to a half hour. Enjoy. Have a good one.